Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I am Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University, and we are glad today to be hosting this conversation about digital literacy, and are particularly glad to be joined by four thoughtful colleagues on this topic. First, Professor Sam Weinberg, who is a professor of education and, by courtesy, of history and American studies here at Stanford, as well as by Mike Caulfield, who is the Director of Blended and Networked Learning at Washington State University, Vancouver. And he is the developer of a wide range of online educational games, tools, and e-learning projects, both for the nonprofit sector and for Fortune 500 companies. And Mike also hosts a long-running blog on educational tech issues and is a co-founder of the online political community Blue Hampshire, a site which I have learned was described as one of the most influential blogs in the nation and one of 8 blog communities chosen a few years ago for syndication by Newsweek's Ruckus Project. And in addition to these scholars, we are being joined by 2 practitioners, librarians at Rowan University, Andrea Baer and Dan Kipnis, who are pioneering approaches to help students evaluate online sources and also researching the impact of these interventions. Andrea is the history and political science librarian at Rowan and has been an academic instruction librarian for almost a decade. And Dan is the life sciences librarian at Rowan and has been an academic librarian for 19 years. So thank you all for joining us today. First, just a little bit of background for anyone who's not familiar with the Cyber Policy Center. All of our research and teaching focuses on improving the governance of digital technologies, in particular when it comes to their impact on geopolitics, security, and democracy. And we are home to about a half dozen programs and are hosting these webinars every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific. Now, for today's, on the topic of digital literacy, this is something that we have looked at once before, thinking more about the research on that topic, whereas today we're going to be talking a lot about the potential administration through the public school system and what we've learned about what is and isn't working. I think what we do know is that the information environment has changed really dramatically in recent years, and readers have been struggling to keep up, and Sam's research really underscores this helpfully. We know that between 2008 and 2019, employment at newspapers dropped by more than 50%, and that by 2018, social media sites like Twitter and Facebook had actually surpassed print newspapers in the US as a more frequent source of news. And for the first time this year, social media sites also surpassed cable, network, and local TV as a primary source of political news for 1 in 5 Americans now. And this is particularly pronounced amongst younger adults. US adults under the age of 30, we find that 50% get their most of their political news from social media, which really suggests that these numbers are going to grow considerably in the future as these younger populations reach maturity. So I think this raises a lot of questions about how we can make sure that that coming generations know how to make sense of these kinds of online sources. And so I want to turn first to Sam to talk about research that he and his colleagues recently did, finding that even the most digitally literate students seem to be struggling to sort out fact from fiction, even when given quite a bit of time to do so. So Sam, I'd love to start with you and just hear 5 or 10 minutes of remarks on your research and recommendations coming from that. And then would like to turn it over, Mike, to you for 5 to 10 minutes reflecting on your experience with digital literacy and online learning, on the recommendations that Sam put forth in his report, and just in general on your suggestions around how the field of digital literacy can best move forward. And then would like to take another 5 or 10 minutes from there, Andrea and Dennis, to hear more about the instructional approach of lateral learning that you all have pursued and the research findings from that. And then after that, we'll save about 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A. There is a function for adding questions, so would appreciate if everyone wants to go ahead in the audience and add your questions there. You can up and down vote them, and I'll do my best to moderate those at the end. But Sam, with that, would love to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So it was about 20 years ago that Mark Prensky coined a term that we've been struggling to free ourselves from ever since. Watching young people use digital devices, Prensky called them digital natives. their parents, their grandparents, people with graying hair such as myself, people who fumbled uploading a photo to Facebook. We were known as digital immigrants, people who used devices with a kind of awkwardness that immediately outed us as foreigners. Now, no one would deny that kids today operate devices with an incredible fluidity almost from birth, but we've made an inferential error. We've assumed that because students know how to operate devices, they also know how to vet the information that these devices produce. When we actually test this assumption, we find the opposite to be true. Gen Z is as susceptible to misinformation as the rest of us. Last month, my research team released a study that we did at a large East Coast university where we asked 263 sophomores, juniors, and seniors to assess a variety of different websites. So to give you a taste of what we found, I'm going to share my screen and let you take a look at one of the sites. So I'm going to hope this works. So this is a site called Minimumwage.com, and it lists its parent site, a group called the Employment Policies Institute. Students had 12 minutes to do whatever they wanted to do in order to test the reliability of the site. They could stay on it, they could leave it, they could, I don't know, watch cat videos on YouTube, whatever they wanted to do. We gave them 12 minutes, but we told them at the end they would be asked to come up with a judgment about whether this was an objective site in learning about the nuances of minimum wage policy. Now, when students actually put a few simple words into their browser, like the name of the organization and a keyword like funding, this is what they came up with. They learned that it was there's an actual answer, a quick internet search that shows the institute is run by a restaurant industry lobbyist who has a vested interest in not having the minimum wage increased. The problem is that such answers were rare. The vast majority of students, 9 out of 10, remained clueless about who was behind this site. And more concerning was that 85% of the students, given 12 minutes to do whatever they wanted on the open internet, never left the target site. Now, it's not that these students lacked strategies. The problem is that the strategies that they deployed to come up with judgments about web credibility were the very ones that we've taught them to use. An iatrogenic disease in medicine is something that is physician-induced. It's when a physician fails to wash her hands and causes a sepsis and the patient dies. In education, the way that we've taught digital literacy has contributed, I believe, to students' inability to tell the difference between truth and sham. So here's some strategies that you will typically find on many, many college websites. That when you land on a site, you should study it carefully. You should look for indicators, its aesthetics, it's whether it has banner ads, whether it has a contact address, whether it's been recently updated. Another thing, you should go to the About page. And rather than telling students an About page is a cultivated vision of what an organization wants you to think, no different from somebody's Instagram feed, they often leave it as the information you find on the About page without any warning. And then probably most common is that you should give weight to a site's top level domain, its URL. A .com is suspect, but a .org means that the organization is a nonprofit and nonprofits work to advance the public good. This is something you find all over the web. And it is, let me just add, it's patently false. The domain of choice for groups that the Southern Poverty Law Center has labeled hate groups is, by the way, .org. But the bigger problem is this. What colleges are recommending is the opposite of what professionals do. Landing on an unknown site, the first thing that fact checkers at our nation's most esteemed publications do to learn about a site is, paradoxically, they leave it. They understand the web as a completely different way of reading than the print world. They understand it, as my colleague Mike Caulfield explains, is that on the web, the way to establish authority and truth online is to use the web's web-like properties. In other words, to leave a site and to turn to the broader network web to get a fix on an original site's reliability. Now, students can be taught to do this. In a study that we did at San Jose State University, we were able to move the needle in as little as 150 minutes of instruction. At the University of North Texas, we just completed a study of asynchronous instruction in a nutrition course. You'll see on a pretest, this term that I've circled, lateral reading, which is our term for students going off a site and turning to the web. They barely used it on the pretest, less than 7%. There's close to 1,000% increase in the post-test, where one of the first things they do to assess a vitamin site is they go off and they turn to the broader web. We are in a post-Sputnik moment today. We are on the brink of defeating a deadly virus, but we haven't even begun to figure out how to defeat a virus that pollutes our information supply. So here are a few things that we can do. First, do no harm. We need to update our information. Here is Princeton's page that they use. They're using a 1998 article from the web's Paleolithic era in order to guide students what to do on the web. So we need to just first get our act together, and this we can do immediately. The second thing we need to do is to engage in curriculum development. We need to launch a major educational R&D effort to develop a host of new materials and courses and modules. We believe that it's educational malpractice to send undergraduates to the web without first providing systematic instruction. And people like to Andrea Baer and Dan Kipnis and their colleagues at the University of Louisville are really the vanguard in this response. And then finally, we need a sober recognition by the university community that this, yes, we can regulate the platforms, and we can have little kind of disclaimers on false posts. But this is first and foremost an educational problem. And changes will require, obviously, the expertise of people like Dan and Andrea. But to think that only they shoulder the responsibility of this at a time when knowledge is under assault, when facts are assailed, when expertise is diminished, the challenge of preparing students for coping with the digital age must be met by every member of the university community. Thank you.
Sam, thank you so much for that. And Mike, would love to turn to you for just, reactions to this and also just insights from your experience working in this space for such a long time.
Yeah, sure. So back in late 2016, early 2017, really looking at Sam's work and combining it with my history in working in these areas of civic digital literacy. I produced a methodology called SIFT, and really the distance between what Sam is doing and what I'm doing is quite minuscule. So if you want to just think about the stuff that Sam is showing there as I talk about this, is probably a pretty good match. And we have applied this methodology, SIFT, to stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. We've applied this in a wide variety of contexts at this point. The first thing we did was a pilot with ASCU, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, across about 10 universities with some pre and post testing using some of Sam's assessments. But since then, I'm working with a group in Canada that's doing across over 100 high schools and National Writing Project high schools here in the U.S. And then there are hundreds of colleges that are using the SIFT materials on those sorts of websites that you see, Sam. We're slowly replacing some of that 1998 stuff with the SIFT materials and the SIFT approach. Librarians, as you know, very often shoulder the burden of bringing these skills into classes. That's something we have to change. We have to expand, as Sam said, the people that take responsibility for this. But it's often the first stop, right? And so we've looked at this across a wide variety of settings. And the first thing I'd like to communicate is it works. And it ends up being just simpler than you might think. Although it does require faculty development, it does require resources, it ends up being simpler than one might think. But what I'd like to talk about in relationship to what Sam presented, in relationship to my experience of doing this over the past 4 years, are some of the things that people think will be problems with this approach that turn out not to be the problems, right? People, I think, that are unfamiliar with this area assume the things that are not problematic will be problematic, and things that are problematic, maybe they don't understand the problems associated with them. So the first thing that people say when you say, well, we can teach these methods, these quick assessment methods on the web, the first thing people say is, well, can't work in all classrooms, right? You have a classroom over here in Eastern Kentucky, you have a classroom over here, up in Seattle, Washington. How are you possibly, we get it. You can go to these small liberal arts colleges somewhere in the Northeast and this will work, but how is it going to work in all classrooms? And we just haven't found any indication that it's specific to those classrooms. I mean, obviously, the core skill of a teacher is taking instruction and connecting it to their specific audience, their specific students. So that always happens. But we have had people adopt materials from small liberal arts colleges, large research universities. We have everyone from, if you look at the library adoption of our materials in their training, we have everybody from Oxford College to Liberty University to small ultra-conservative Christian high schools have adopted it. And then worldwide, I just a couple days ago got an email from someone that's applying it in Timor-Leste. We've had our materials translated by volunteers into Catalan with changing the examples. It does seem to be universally applicable, at least this sort of core set of skills. And so we just haven't found any sort of local issues with pushing this out. The second point that people raise is cynicism. They say, well, isn't teaching students to doubt things they read online, isn't that just going to increase cynicism? And there's certainly ways to teach media literacy which might foster cynicism. If your idea of media literacy is you can trust no one, and if you constantly repeat that, at the end of the day, your students might be a bit more cynical, right? That's to be expected. But the methods that we teach are about discernment, right? And they're about quick checks, right? So the idea behind our methods is some things are really complex and nuanced and you'll never know the answer. A lot of things aren't, right? And our idea here is let's get you to the point where if you're looking at that sort of complex, nuanced, will we ever know the answer sort of thing? Or if you're looking at something where, we kind of know the answer, right? So that you can apply your focus, you can apply your critical thinking to the sorts of problems that benefit from it. And what we found is, in general, these sort of 30-second fact checks that we teach students reduce cynicism, right? Students end up less cynical because cynicism, in a way, is sort of a filtering strategy. If you just believe nothing, if you believe everything is sort of equally contaminated and corrupted, well, that's your filter. Like, I can trust nothing, right? We don't need to go into depth. If you give students some of these techniques that allow them to make these quick discernments, right? It reduces cynicism because they learn that some things are relatively known, right? And other things aren't, so they can apply their attention to that. The third thing that comes up is people say, well, what about bias, right? It's just confirmation bias. People just believe what they want to believe. And so teaching skills isn't going to change that because people really desire to believe something and they'll find a way to believe it. Again, I wonder if we're projecting two online boomer pathologies onto our students in ways that are not applicable, because this in general, there are outliers, but this in general is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing actually in the initial reactions of the students as we pre and post test is that students run a lot of stuff through a plausibility filter. And that plausibility filter is full of bias, right? So if you give students the example that Sam uses, we use one of his assessments that uses a NRA prompt. It's a poll that shows that most gun owners support common sense regulations for guns, right? And it's actually mostly true, right? It's some subtleties around it, but it's actually mostly true. And you ask students, hey, do whatever you want, sort of Sam's thing, if you want to go look at cat videos, do that, investigate this however you want, and then tell us, do you think this is good evidence of this fact, right? What do the students say before they receive the instruction? They say things like, well, liberals are always saying this about gun owners, so I don't trust it, right? Or they say, well, I know some gun owners, and these 2 gun owners I know aren't this way, so they run it through this plausibility filter. It's generally filled with bias. Oh, you can't trust anything that Democrat, oh, this is just a Republican, it's just, doesn't seem plausible to me. Does it match my life experience? Does it match my political views? Same student, end of instruction, what do they come out saying? Not every student, but we pair up the pre and post, and we can see this, at least in some students, these dramatic changes where a student will come through. In the beginning, it was just like, I don't believe this because this does not accord with my life experience or my values. And at the end, what do they say? They say, well, this particular poll, there's tweets by a progressive organization, but this particular poll is by a legitimate polling organization. And I looked for other polls. Most of the other polls say the same thing as this one. So it looks like it's true, maybe, We had one student go through all that, give the most brilliant answer on this I'd ever seen, and then it says, I still don't believe it, which is fine, letting your values, be affected by facts takes time. But they're halfway there, right? It's a start. So we're just not really finding the sort of bias roadblocks that we think. And the final thing people ask is, well, does it stick? Well, the students do this, but how do we know they do it outside the classroom? And the answer is, outside of some sort of panopticon of society, you're not going to know precisely whether all students practice this outside of the classroom. But I'll say a couple things. One, we designed these interventions to stick. We keep them very short, we keep them very focused, and we teach them in the environment that students will be outside the classroom. So this isn't something where we teach students, how do you go about this in a classroom environment or a library environment? We're teaching them with the prompts exactly as they would encounter them in the real world. We do the post-testing with a 3-week delay to try to check for skills decay, right? Do they practice them outside of the classroom? I can't speak to everybody, but I can tell you a lot of students come back and they tell you that they're teaching their roommate this. They tell you that they're teaching their parents this, so it's getting outside the classroom somehow, right? And so there's a kind of a learned helplessness with all of this that we're engaged in that I think is just really unmerited. And then the final thing I say about does it stick is you don't actually need, in terms of the social impact, you don't need every student to get everything right 100% of the time. What you're trying to do with education in general is build a herd immunity to nonsense. And even if some of your students leave the classroom, they have these skills and they can be the person in their social group that says, I don't think that's quite right. You've built up something that has real social impact. And while it's very difficult to test student use of these in the classroom, outside of the classroom setting, I feel pretty confident that enough students are bringing these skills outside the classroom that could have a real impact. So those are the questions that tend to come up, the sorts of questions that people think are, going to be roadblocks. We haven't really found to be roadblocks. The real roadblocks have been just. We've got to take this seriously. We've got to fund it, and ultimately, you can produce all the materials you want. If you're not funding faculty development, and you're not doing it across the curriculum, it's not going to institutionalize in a way that is sustainable and enduring. And I think those challenges, those institutional challenges, are what we worry about. A lot of the things people think are difficult to turn out not to be particularly difficult.
Mike, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And Andrea and Dan, would love to now turn to you. You have been sort of on the front lines, actually trying to administer different kinds of curriculum, and would love to hear both more about that curriculum and what you're learning about what works and doesn't.
Thanks so much,
and we're getting a lot of great questions, so please go ahead, folks, and continue to enter those in the chat.
Thanks. So I'm Andrea Baer. I'm the History and Political Science Librarian at Rowan in Campbell Library, and I'm here with my colleague Dan Kipnis, who's a Life Sciences Librarian at Rowan. So we're going to talk with you about some work we've been doing with teaching lateral reading for about 1.5 years. So this is still somewhat new to us, and we've been doing it in a number of different ways. And Dan will talk a little bit more about our context and the different things we've been doing. And then a little bit later, I'll talk in particular about some study findings that we found from how students are engaging with an online tutorial on lateral reading that we've developed. So I'll turn it over to Dan now.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And good morning, good afternoon, and thank you to the Stanford Cyber Center of Policy for inviting us. Sam, Mike, wonderful to see you and to hear your thoughts. A little bit about Rowan, for those of you that aren't familiar with us. We used to be known as Glassboro State University. We're about 30 miles outside of Philadelphia in the bucolic farm fields of South Jersey. And we are a growing institution in a really big way. About 20 years ago, we used to be several thousand students, mostly a teaching college, but we were reclassified recently as an R2 institution, and our enrollment has grown dramatically. We now are pushing close to 20,000 full-time students. And pre-pandemic, we had an initiative to hire 176 new tenure-track faculty over the next 5 years. With the pandemic, who knows where that stands. But one of the other things that readily became apparent was that with the global pandemic, there was an increased need for asynchronous modules, as well as truly a kind of a sharp emphasis on critical source evaluation in online learning. So Andrea and I went ahead and we created some materials that we'd just like to highlight for you. The first one is this toolkit that we've developed, and the link is on the slide and it can be shared through the Q&A, hopefully. And this has a Creative Commons license attached to it. So we do invite you to adopt the tool guide aspects of it for your own institution as well. And it builds upon much of the work that both Sam and Mike have done over the years. We've adopted this for teaching workshops as well as for our tutorials that we've made available. And many institutions have reached out so far and asked for permission to go ahead and adopt it. So that's the very first step we've taken. We adopted this toolkit. The second thing we wanted to do is we wanted to try to develop something a little bit more interactive. So we went ahead and designed this tutorial that lives in the LibGuide platform, and we collect our data using Qualtrics. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to assess how the students are engaging with aspects of lateral reading. We're trying to capture what is it that they're thinking, kind of the middle of their thinking. What is the process that they're going through as they go through our tutorial. And we've used a lot of scaffolded instruction in creating our tutorials. So we have a pre-test. We go ahead and model how Andrea and I would go ahead and do a critical source evaluation. We have the students practice and kind of share kind of what they've taken away from the process. So scaffolding definitely is a very big part of what we're trying to do and create this interactive tutorial. And we're trying to kind of build it on learning supports. So we have kind of a development where we can track how the students are doing over time. And what I'll do now is I'll hand it back to Andrea, and she's going to share with you some of the findings that we have from our tutorial. Andrea, you're muted.
Sorry there, I got, can you all hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, the screen kind of switched on me and I couldn't get to the right place, so sorry about that. Yeah, thank you, Dan. All right, so this semester, this fall semester, we have we did a research study on how students were engaging with this tutorial. So we had 141 first-year business students who completed this. And what we found, one was that there was a notable increase of the use of lateral reading once students had completed the tutorial. And the tutorial we estimated to take between 30 and 40 minutes. When engaging in lateral reading, students, many of those students, I would say most of the students who did lateral reading at the end did what we call a depth analysis, where they would actually ask critical questions while they were looking for information about that source that would help them to better understand how credible or how trustworthy is this source. So they might ask things like, what's the purpose of this source? What's their agenda? And there was about 27% of those who were engaging in lateral reading who did more of a kind of surface analysis, where they were moving off of the page looking for other information, but they had difficulty finding what we might call trusted coverage, as Mike will sometimes use that term, or they just weren't really asking the right questions that would help them to get insight into the trustworthiness of this source. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we also noticed that there was a common use of ineffective evaluation strategies, much like Sam has talked about, a lot of talking about looking at .com versus .org as one of the key indicators of how reliable a source is. Things like going to the About page. So much of what he's described here and in other research, we were seeing in the pre-test especially, but still in the post-test as well. So that like learning kind of hangs around once that's been ingrained in you. And all of this is showing us that there's really a need for continued practice and guidance with critical source analysis. So we saw notable improvements in students before and after, but we also still saw them struggling. So here we did a pre-test, and we had students evaluate two sources on a scale of 1 to 4. So 4 would be highly credible, 1 would be not at all credible. And you can see here the results. So there is very little difference between how students evaluated these two sources, but these two sources are quite different sources. So the one on the left, the American College of Pediatricians, is essentially a hate site that opposes LGBTQ+ rights. The one on the right, American Academy of Pediatrics, is quite a reputable source. So if one is to engage in lateral reading, it won't take too long to figure this out. So we asked students, in addition to evaluating these two sources, to briefly describe for us what their process was for evaluating the sources. And we found that we only had 3 students of the 141 who described some kind of lateral reading happening. And you can see the evaluations are almost identical. So the large majority were saying it was either mostly credible, that's the red, or highly credible, that's the blue. And again, like even though they're very different sources, students really had trouble distinguishing between those. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. Now here is a post activity. We actually use minimumwage.com, which is the site that Sam was talking about earlier. So not a credible source, right? But it looks pretty good on the surface. So if you were to do a lot of the strategies that students have been taught to use, looking the About page, that kind of thing, it would look like a pretty good source. So at the end of this tutorial, taking about 30 to 40 minutes for students to complete, we see that there is a more critical evaluation of the source compared to in the pretest. We found that about 38% of the students evaluated this source to be either not at all credible or mostly not credible, right? So they correctly found that this is a problematic source. That means that about 62% still saw it as highly credible. So we've got an improvement, but there's still a lot of room to grow. We also saw that we had about, excuse me, I need to look at one thing real quick, make sure I'm giving you the right number. About 39% who were engaging in lateral reading. So when they described their process for us, we could see some indication of them moving off of the page and finding what others are saying about this source. So definitely improvement from 3 out of 141, right? But still many of them after that short intervention, it wasn't quite enough to get them doing that. Now, of those who did lateral reading, overall, we saw a marked improvement in how well they evaluated the source. Many, however, still struggled. There were about 27% of those who did engage in lateral reading who were doing what we're calling the surface analysis. So they move off of the page, but they don't necessarily ask the right questions. So they might, for example, simply look to see if Minimumwage.com gives a lot of information about minimum wage on different states. So we had a lot of students who said, well, the minimum wage in New Jersey is this amount. And I went off of the page and I verified this somewhere else. So this is a credible source, right? So they're not always looking at what would really help them to understand whether or not this is trustworthy. Again, that's a majority, that's about 27%, but it's enough that we're seeing that just the act of going off of the website is often not quite enough. They may need a little more guidance in what kinds of questions to ask. So we'll move on to the next slide. So thinking about all of this and our next steps, one thing we want to do is we want to do some more detailed analysis of our data. This is just a very preliminary analysis. And we're also developing 2 follow-up tutorials. The first one, which will be bringing together lateral reading and critical source analysis. So offering students more guidance on how they can be asking these critical questions and making lateral reading and critical source analysis processes that happen side by side. And then another tutorial that will be focused more specifically on perspective and bias. So we're continuing to reach out to faculty and other librarians to adopt our tutorials or use some of the other things we've developed, as well as just having conversations with people about different approaches that we can take. So we're also looking forward to a little bit of discussion with you here today as part of that work. Thank you.
Great, thank you all so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. And so wanted to turn now to questions. And for anyone who has some still outstanding, please go ahead and just introduce those into the Q&A box. I'm gonna group the ones that we've received so far into 2 main categories. We have a number of questions about what exactly should we be teaching, or how, what should be included in that curriculum, how to address different problems with the or questions with the curriculum itself. And then we have a second category of questions that are really the how do we implement this? How do we go about rolling this out at some kind of scale? So I'm going to start with the questions around what to teach. And I'll throw 3 out there. How do we keep this apolitical? And so there are examples of content that might have to do with climate change or oil, fracking, things like that in different states, and how we manage that. What do we think about not just digital literacy, but algorithmic literacy? And is there some role for greater education in how algorithms work, which I have always sort of treated as a separate category, but I'm not sure if you guys think about this in tandem. And then a third question from Professor Metaxas, whose daughter is at Stanford with us, and we are big fans of Danae's, that was about, how much do we think about these sort of the mechanical rules, the sort of tips and tricks and heuristics for helping students ascertain the validity or authenticity of different sites, versus really getting more into the epistemology of why we believe what we believe and helping people understand that better. So those are the 3 questions on sort of what do we teach, how do we keep it apolitical, how do we think about algorithms, and what is the role of teaching about epistemology here? Any thoughts?
Can I answer the epistemology question? This is actually a question I'm so excited to answer this question. So a lot of what we have looks like, we sometimes even call them tricks, and little hacks to kind of make them to convey that these things are not threatening, that they're not necessarily hard. But there's a fundamentally different epistemology, right? Underlying, philosophers will get on my case if I say different epistemology. There's a fundamentally different epistemic stance underlying something like CRAP or some of these other approaches out there in underlying lateral reading. it represents a major shift in how we think about how we know what we know that people struggle with. And the difference is this: we have to move as a society from a very individualistic epistemology, right, to understanding the mechanics of social epistemologies. We have to realize that how we know what we know really deals with social structures, social institutions, various social processes, those sorts of things. That's how we end up knowing most of what we know in the policy space. If you actually look at the people that are most confused by the web, they are the people that think that they can just get out there, pull a couple stats down from a voting site, and prove that the world doesn't know the massive scam that's going on in Wisconsin because they were able to, compute, a standard deviation on some numbers in an Excel spreadsheet, right? That's a very individual, that's the idea. I got to verify this thing myself. I've got to come to my own conclusion, that sort of thing. The stuff that we tend to show students is actually, how do you tap in to the knowledge in the network? How do you figure out if there is some sort of consensus around an issue? How do you figure out where to go to find that consensus? What consensus looks like? What sorts of documents or organizations might provide you some sense of that, if it exists, or if there's dissensus, if dissensus exists, right? So underlying this is this shift that I think we all have to make in our sort of theory of knowledge, where the idea is to help people navigate the social epistemology rather than convince them that they're going to pull out a bunch of test tubes whenever they hit something they don't understand and conduct the experiment themselves. That's a harder sell. That's one of the reasons why we need this across the curriculum, so we can eventually get into that depth. But we have worked very hard, I think, to make sure that there is this coherent understanding that underlies the sorts of approaches we're giving students. And down the road, if we can make that more explicit for students, that would be great.
Can I just add a bit about the epistemology there? That at the heart of the idea of lateral reading, which is really that you leave a site in order to learn about that original site and you turn to the web. That basic act is a deep epistemological position. And when you compare it to the way that we teach kids, for instance, think of the SAT. Kids are presented with a reading text with the presumption that it is true and that you look at it and then you read it carefully and you answer the questions at the end. And it is that epistemology of reading and text that they bring to the web. And the web is a completely different animal. There is no publisher that is vetting what goes up on the web. There's no subject matter expert that is looking and giving a seal of approval to it. The act of reading, essentially, that students bring where they stay on the website, is a deep belief that they have the critical thinking abilities to read carefully and to discern whether a site is true or false or reliable or untrustworthy simply by looking at it. And underlying that is an assumption that they can outsmart the web. And not only is it young people, professors, in a study that we did, and I can give anybody the reference to it, where we compared university academics from 4 different universities, Stanford undergraduates, and professional fact checkers. The biggest problem that the 2 former groups had, both the academics and the Stanford undergraduates, was they thought that they were smarter than the web. And in that example that Andrea and Dan presented about the American College of Pediatricians, which is a splinter group, an anti-LGBT hate group, Stanford undergraduates actually said that it was a more reliable site than the 64,000 member American Academy of Pediatrics. That is something that should concern all of us, and it's a deep epistemological problem.
Thank you all. Andrea, Dan?
Yeah, I was going to just say a couple of things and leave space for Dan to do that too, if he'd like. I think that this question is perhaps partly getting at the issue of confirmation bias, right, and motivated reasoning, that we have a natural tendency to want to believe the things that affirm our views, and it's much harder for us to believe the things that challenge our views. And so one part of Mike's work with SIFT that I found really useful, we've incorporated this into our work, is that first step of stopping and pausing, right? That and helping people, you know, we say students, but really this stuff I think is relevant to everybody, to stop, pause, and recognize that we have this tendency to, like, a knee-jerk reaction, all of us, right? Like every one of us sitting here, that we prefer to believe the stuff that just confirms our beliefs. So in having that awareness and doing that pause, we can slow ourselves down and move into a more critical and less reactive frame of mind. And I think that this kind of, like making this a habit, which is harder to do when you're sitting online and things move so quickly and you get into, you know, especially you're on social media and like things are moving so fast, that I think that often is not a habit that we practice. And related to that, when we're looking at like curriculum and class climate, cultivating an inclusive class climate, and for that matter, like an inclusive and welcoming environment wherever we are, that this research has shown that this helps people to feel less threatened. And when we feel less threatened, we're better able to do that pause, to move out of a reactive state. And we feel safer to then look at views that may not fit with our own. So I think a lot of this just kind of cultivating that kind of environment and that way of being and interacting with ourselves and others is really key, and by no means simple or quick.
Great. Other thoughts on this? So I'll move on to about a half dozen other questions we've had come in that are a little more on the implementation side. I will note we did not, and please, if others have questions, go ahead. And
very brief. I just want to add.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
No, I was just going to add to Andrea's point, the idea of click restraint. She talked about stopping and pausing, but I think we see this with many of our students is kind of the speed at which they function. So the concept of click restraint, I think, is coming to play for us, and we've incorporated that as well into our tutorials.
And just real quick, that's something that Sam and the folks at SHEG have really emphasized, right? Is that you don't just immediately click on any link, but rather you try to skim a page, search results page, and look at overall what's showing up before you decide what to click on and what you're going to use to learn more about that original source.
We love the video they've created.
Yeah.
If I could just add about that, it's one of the big things that we see distinguishes between professional fact checkers and students. And there's a certain set of assumptions that are behind it. Students often believe that Google has purchase on celestial intelligence, and that there's no such thing as search engine optimization that changes and mixes results, and that somehow, and again, this is according to some studies, place it as high as 60% of users click on either the first or second result. And what fact checkers do is that they follow the step one of SIFT. They stop. And they stop not only to gauge their emotional reaction, but they stop to get a gestalt of what the SERP, of what the search engine results page produces, so that they try to figure out what information neighborhood have I landed in. And with 10 minutes of scanning the SERP, and these are things that we don't teach, so why would we expect students to do them? They make a much wiser first click. And we all know that that first click is destiny. You know, it's like we all know what happens with that first click 30 minutes later, where we end up and we don't even know how we've gotten there. So again, the opposite of click restraint is promiscuous clicking. And it's something that we see very, very common among youth.
Well, Sam, that's lovely. I have my two favorite quotes probably of the month there, the promiscuous clicking and that the first click is destiny. So really helpful responses here. I noticed we didn't touch on this question around how to keep it apolitical. I think it might be helpful to just touch on that very quickly. You know, I have seen a number of different types of media or news or digital literacy courses that are sort of agnostic to content and just teach approaches. I've even seen things that folks have started to try and roll out with the social media platforms that are just basic nudges, like David Rand at MIT and colleagues have been experimenting with, of just, do you think it's important to share or to think about the quality of the content you're sharing before you do so, and that actually having a measurable effect on the quality of the content that people are sharing. So I'd be curious your guys' thoughts on how important is it to have examples like the ones that you have brought forth, which are, for the most part, inherently sort of politically contentious. How essential is it in having that in the curriculum itself versus just teaching technique agnostic of content?
We generally work up to it in the classroom. You do want to test people with some contentious prompts, because one of the things you want to test is, even in the face of something I might not like to believe, how do I react to this? But if you look at the sequence of, like we have there's a number of things we've built that sort of sequence materials that people can use. We start with things that are not necessarily politically contentious. We start with things that are, celebrity death hoaxes, or, Photoshop pictures of people, that have muscled up when they haven't, or things like that, right? And then you get into some of these other things where one of the things we found with undergraduates is a lot of them, at least historically, have not particularly been invested in health disinformation just as a part of life stage. And so we've often worked with that where they're not necessarily. And then eventually you do get into these other things. But what you're trying to do is build the habits so that when they hit some of the contentious stuff, they still just take the 45 seconds before they do it. And sometimes they go through the 45 seconds and they find out a bunch more and they get a bunch more educated and they say, yeah, but still, and that's fine. That's what change looks like, right? But I think the answer is sequencing is important. You start with things that don't have identity threat. You build up the skills. And then I do think that if you give them that running start, that they do apply the skills successfully to more contentious material.
Thank you. That was a really helpful answer. And so I'd love to now move to the sort of implementation side of the question. We have 6 or 7 minutes left and about 5 questions. So this will be a lightning round of sort of 1 minute per answer to the questions, if we can pull it off. So the first is, how do we roll this out to faculty? I'll read them all quickly now, and then I'll just go through them sort of one by one. The second is, how do we think about doing this outside the classroom? And that speaks to this question that Zeev Sanderson, our colleague at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU, brought up, that I think they had done a study that something like 80% of shares of quote unquote fake news were coming from older populations. So not the target sort of in-school audience for this content. So how do we roll out to faculty? How do we think about doing this outside of the classroom? Do we think it would be helpful to embed this across curriculum, which I take to mean, could we embed this in social studies and history and writing in a whole bunch of different kinds of classes? And then a last question on what the funding looks like in this space, which if folks here don't have answers to, I can take on, since I used to sit in that chair. So do we want to start with, how do we think about rolling this out to faculty? This is a question I'm particularly interested in, especially at the Hewlett Foundation, where I worked previously. We were one of the largest K-12 education reform funders, and found it excruciatingly hard to try and secure change at the federal level, and then started working at regional, and then got even sort of more hyper local. But I think these questions around how do we roll this out are really interesting. I know that there was a great group, iCivics, that Sandra Day O'Connor was on the board of, that we had done some work with, that had basically gone straight to digital, bypassed the sort of federal requirements, and just tried to get these tools directly into the hands of teachers, and had quite a bit of success there. So I don't know if you all have thought about the implementation side or how to roll this out. If not, we can move on to the next question, but I'll pause for a second in case you have thoughts here.
Well, I'll start the ball rolling and try to do it quickly. We have a history curriculum, a document-based history curriculum that's been downloaded 10 million times. It's used in every single state in the country, and it's used everywhere in the world with the exception of North Korea. It's been adopted in LAUSD as the curriculum. And it started not by an imposition or a mandate. It sort of started by the bottom up. It's one strategy. I'm not saying it's the only strategy. But when you make curricula that are free and that are better than the kind of commercially available curricula, people start to use it and it starts to spread. And that is, I think, we're talking about the dangers of social media. This is one of the benefits of social media. When there's quality, quality spreads, and we've seen it with our own educational products. And so certainly that's one way to do it. The thing that we just did at the University of North Texas is a set of asynchronous modules. Once that goes through a full vetting process, these are the things that can be made widely available, put up on the web, and college and university faculty, even if they haven't undergone particular training, can embed those in particular courses. So there's just two ideas. I'll stop there.
Oh, good. This gives me hope. Thank you for that. I had always been unsure how one would move forward here. Okay, any thoughts on outside the classroom? I appreciate that this isn't the focus of this panel. I know many groups are working outside the classroom. Groups like IREX are doing trainings in almost 100 countries around the world. First Draft has just rolled out, First Draft News, that has been run by Claire Warder for a while, has just rolled out a text-based training that people can sign up for. And as I said, David Rand and others have been experimenting with rolling these kinds of what they call accuracy nudges out through the platforms themselves to try and reach broader audiences. Any other thoughts on reaching adults here? Recognizing this is not the inherent focus of this group.
Well, I do know that there are public librarians who have been doing a lot of this kind of work. And unfortunately, there is often not as much collaboration among public librarians and academic librarians as I think would be ideal for numerous complicated reasons. But I think, the more, and I think events like this, the more kind of conversations and collaborations and connections we can make, because it's very easy to get siloed into your own world. And finding platforms like this that are bringing together people from within and outside of different academic contexts is, I think, a really important step. And I also think like the pandemic has kind of highlighted for us how important these things are, and that it's gaining more traction and more momentum.
Also, if people are looking for a name, Chris Coward up at University of Washington is doing some of this, educating people about misinformation, libraries as an agent of social change work up there at University of Washington.
And the issue of librarians also addresses the issue of equity, because so many of the people who use our public libraries are people who don't have high-speed internet at home. Mm-hmm. And they are, if we could come up with a way to figure out modules and to use libraries as sources of public education for a whole variety of people, it might be something that actually serves to narrow some of the deep divisions among people of different social classes.
This is such a great point, and I think would love to, with that, transition to this question of funders, because I think you've both just provided some great ideas of things that could be funded. And then I want to save 1 minute for next steps of just other events we're about to host, and also 1 minute for just to do a quick lightning round of last thoughts from any of you before we close out. On the funding source, there aren't a huge number of funders that have come in significantly here. The Knight Foundation has done some work. Klarman Foundation and Stanton Foundation have done some work here. The McCormick Foundation has done a bit of work here, I think predominantly in the Illinois area. And then Facebook just made a $2 million commitment in this space, the details of which are still forthcoming, but folks can look that up. So this is a space where there really hasn't been a great deal of funding, because the education funders seem to think it's someone else's job more on the policy side. The democracy funders seem to think it's the education funders' job, and it's a little bit of a pass the buck situation here. So I think there really are some very interesting opportunities. I will stop there. Last round of comments from any of our speakers. A huge thanks for having you join us. But yes, any last thoughts before we turn to next steps? All right. Well, thank you all so much. This has been really, really informative and very, very helpful. So thank you. With that, I will turn over to a couple of events we have upcoming. The next one, which I think is going to be really quite interesting, is next week on the 10th. This is a 4-hour event from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. on digital technology, social media, in the 2020 presidential election. We have a half dozen colleagues from other universities who will each be taking 10 minutes to share their findings on what happened during the elections. And then we have a panel of representatives from Facebook, Twitter, and Google to talk through their experiences, what they learned, what surprised them, what they will be doing differently moving forward. To my knowledge, this is the first time this particular group has all gotten together to talk since the elections. So although I may have missed something, but I think this will be quite an interesting dialogue. We then come back in January for an event, Which Side of History? Common Sense's Jim Steyer, our colleague Maricha Shake, who recently stepped down from European Parliament, our colleague Renee DiResta have all authored chapters in this forthcoming book about accountability in the tech platforms. We'll be discussing that on the 13th. And then, of course, Europe is about to implement the Digital Services Act, which is going to have huge implications for the governance of digital technologies globally, and we will be discussing that at the end of January. So hope to see folks there. In the meantime, thank you all so much. It really was a pleasure to learn more about this from you all. So thank you, and take care, everyone.